that way. Okay, so on Wednesday, we were talking about carbon cycling, which is driven by photosynthesis and respiration. The photosynthesis that plants and certain bacteria and protists do takes carbon dioxide gas out of the atmosphere, combines it with water and with a few mineral nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus that plants would get out of the soil, and takes that carbon dioxide and converts it into more complicated molecules, starting with simple sugars. And those are retained as part of the plant's body as the plant grows. And we call that fixing carbon. When plants die and they rot, or when they live and get eaten by primary consumers, or when plants get eaten by primary consumers and the primary consumers get eaten by secondary consumers, and so on, those consumers and decomposers break down the plant tissue, and a waste product of that process is carbon dioxide, which they breathe out, and CO2 goes back into the atmosphere. And yeah, that breakdown process by which you extract energy is called respiration. So photosynthesis puts it in, respiration takes it out. We talked about some wrinkles to that on a global scale on Wednesday, where we talked about carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere and the ultimate cause of global climate change. Right. The second cycle I want to cover is the hydrologic cycle, which is primarily driven by solar energy. Hydrologic just means it has to do with water. And as the sun shines, water evaporates. You know, it rained a lot recently and there's puddles around here and they will slowly disappear. And that's what's happening to them, of course, duh. And that happens everywhere there is warm temperatures. Water is constantly evaporating from rivers, lakes, the oceans, puddles, dewdrops. All of those evaporate and become water vapor and go into the atmosphere. Now, water leaves the atmosphere in the form of rain or snow, hail, sleet, fog, frost, what have you. And when water falls on land, it may form little trickles, which may come together and form tiny creeks and little streams, which may join together and form larger creeks and eventually rivers. And ultimately, those rivers flow to the ocean. Of course, a lot of rain falls directly into the ocean. And some water may step out of the active cycle for a long time. Some water soaks into the ground and ultimately ends up deep below the ground in the form of groundwater. Groundwater is what you're tapping into if you drill a well. Groundwater also naturally comes back to the surface in the form of springs, things like that. Water might also get locked out if it freezes and falls on the Arctic and the Antarctic, or on high mountains where it builds up ice caps and glaciers. Water in groundwater or water in glaciers and ice caps is out of the loop for a while. So there's a complete hydrologic cycle in one picture. That's just rain falling on the Pacific Ocean. Water, because of the sun, is evaporating from the ocean. The water vapor ultimately condenses into little droplets and forms clouds. And in the distance, that cloud is raining those droplets right back down into the ocean. So there's a complete hydrologic cycle in one photo. And you probably already know this really well. I know my kid was learning about it in kindergarten. So I'm assuming you're not unfamiliar with, where rain comes from and things like that. So there's a slightly more involved diagram if you need it. Water evaporates from vegetation, streams, soils, the ocean, from something that plants do, the loss of water vapor from plant leaves, which is called transpiration, goes into the ocean, goes into the atmosphere. Water vapor in the atmosphere starts forming little droplets. That's what a cloud is. And from a cloud, the little droplets fall. I assume you get the point here. One thing I'm going to add to this, because it's important in the distribution of biomes, and I'll talk about what I mean by biomes in just a bit. Solar energy causes water to evaporate, but it also moves it around. It distributes water vapor, and it does it by a process called convection. If you don't know what convection is, try this sometime. Start heating a saucepan of water on the stove and drop in something like just a couple of raisins, maybe. And as that water gets hotter, what you'll see is the raisins will start rising from the bottom, and they'll reach the surface, and then they'll drop back down. And what you end up with is this circular flow of water in the pan. It's heated down on the bottom where it's close to the burner. That heated water rises, but as it rises, it gets up to the surface away from the burner, it cools down, and the now slightly cooler water sinks. And so you get this vertical pattern of circulation, where water's heated and it rises. When it rises up here, it gives off heat, cools just a little bit, and sinks back down, and that keeps going and going. And you can see it in a pan on the stove if you add something that'll flow with the water. The same thing that happens to the water in a pan being heated on a stove burner happens to the atmosphere. Warm air rises. We actually saw an example of that on Wednesday when I mentioned thermals, when I mentioned that when vultures go around in a circle, it's because they're in a zone of rising air that's rising faster than gravity is pulling the birds down, so they can stay in the air for long periods without having to flap. So every time warm air rises, as air rises, it expands, and as air expands, it starts cooling. This is a piece of physics I'm not really going to get into, but the pressure of gas is related to its temperature. Let's say you take some gas under high pressure, like let's say a spray can, and you shake it up and you start spraying. Maybe you're spraying graffiti or something like that. If you do that, the can will become noticeably cooler because the gas in the can is decreasing in pressure. And when pressure goes down, temperature goes down. And when pressure goes up, temperature goes up. The same thing is happening to air as it rises. As it rises, it expands because there's less pressure on it. As it expands, it gets cold. And because cold air can hold less moisture than warm air, the cooler air that's rising starts dropping out its water vapor in the form of rain or other precipitation. So wherever air rises, you get rain. As air sinks, it does the opposite. It compresses, it gets warm. And so wherever you get sinking air, you don't get rain because the air has already lost a lot of its moisture. It's already dry and it's heating up as it sinks down. So rising air means cooling air, means air that starts dropping its moisture.
Spoon.
Sinking air means warming air and air that doesn't have any moisture. Solar radiation ultimately does this on a global scale. Solar energy is hitting the Earth most directly pretty close to the equator. It's not exactly on the equator because the axis of the Earth is tilted, but let's not get into that right now. You may well have noticed that the closer you are to the equator, the warmer it tends to get. Well, because solar energy is hitting the Earth most directly at the equator, that warms the Earth, and the Earth warms the atmosphere, and we have lots of rising air at the equator. Where air rises, it sinks, where air rises, it cools and drops its moisture. So we tend to get lots of rain at the equator. By and large, the equatorial zone is a pretty damp area. Okay, so we get this belt of lots of rain that's close to the equator, although again, it's not exactly centered on it because of the tilt of the Earth. And we call that equatorial area the intertropical convergence zone right there. So we have rising air at the equator, and as the air rises, it starts moving north and south, and ultimately it sinks. And where it comes down is at about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. So we have this cell of circulating air that's warmed and rises at the equator, and then comes around and drops down at about 30 degrees north, and over there at 30 degrees south. So you have this enormous, 7-mile thick and maybe 2,000 kilometer wide global pattern of circulating air, with air rising in the equator and sinking at 30 north and 30 south. That big pattern of rising and sinking air, by the way, is called a Hadley cell. There's one of the consequences. That's a weather satellite view of the Earth. That's South America down there. At the top of the photo, you're seeing southern Mexico and Central America. For anybody who didn't know, South America is down at the lower right, and of course, there's Peru, and Bolivia is down in here more or less. And you can see running right across the Pacific, that band of lots of clouds, that's called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ, and it does shift north and south with the seasons. That shift is ultimately why, if you're living in the tropics, instead of a summer and a winter, you probably have a dry season and a rainy season. There's more to it than that, but that will do. And that's ultimately caused by all of that rising air that's picking up a lot of moisture, lifting it up, and then dropping it back down in the form of rain. So you can see that rain band right there on satellite. That's the intertropical convergence zone. And if we map average yearly rainfall, we get this. The purple and red colors are the parts of the Earth that get by far the most rain. So you can see there is a big stripe of very rainy climate, more or less centered on the equator, running here. That's across the Pacific Ocean. And a slightly less rainy, but still pretty prominent one centered on the equator in the middle of the Atlantic. The presence of land can break the pattern in various ways, but you can still see there's a very rainy zone right there in South America. The equatorial part of Africa tends to be where the wettest climates are, and so on. If you look at the orange areas, that's where there's the least average rainfall. And notice something, they're all centered on this 30-degree north line and this 30-degree south line, all right? So that's the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, the Atacama Desert in northern Chile, the Great Australian Desert in the south. And then here we've got the Mojave and Chihuahua and Sonora deserts in the US and Mexico, the Sahara Desert in Africa, the Rub al Khali in Saudi Arabia, the Gobi Desert up here in China. Notice that they're all located close to those 30-degree lines north and south. That's ultimately set up by those Hadley cells. 30 degrees north and 30 south is where you have the descending arm of those Hadley cells, where the dry air is coming down. As it drops down, it warms up, but it doesn't have any moisture in it. So that's why you get deserts in these. That's why you get deserts where you get them. This is, of course, not the whole story, and part of what you're not seeing is the effects of ocean currents. So, for example, this thing right up here, this area of moisture is the effect of the Gulf Stream, a major current that crosses the Atlantic. These hooks right here of very wet conditions in this direction, that's also moisture that's carried by ocean currents. So there's more to it than just this, but the overall pattern should be reasonably clear. And this is what sets up the distribution of some major biomes. You might remember that a biome is a global grouping of similar ecosystems. The Sahara Desert in Africa and the Australian Desert and the Mojave Desert in Southern California and Nevada, they're on different continents and they've got different species of animals and plants, but even though the species are different, they share very similar adaptations. They share plants with very deep roots, plants that have tissues that can absorb lots of water and store it for a long period of time, plants with lots of spines to keep other critters from getting the water that they stored. South Australia doesn't have native cactus, for example, but the vegetation is quite spiky, even though it's technically not cactus. Although they introduced cactus, but that's another story. Same with the Sahara. They don't have cactus. They have plants called euphorbs, but they're very similar because they store water in their tissues and many of them have spikes. So even very widely separated areas may have very different species, but they'll tend to show common adaptations if they're part of the same biome. So deserts make up a biome. Tropical rainforests make up a biome. Temperate coastal forests like you'd get up here in the Pacific Northwest of Canada, Alaska, Washington State, that makes up a biome. Grasslands like the Western American prairies and the pampas of Argentina make up yet another biome. There's lots of different biomes, and understanding atmospheric flow and understanding the hydrologic cycle is the key to understanding why those biomes are in the places that they're in. Ta-da! All right, I'm imagining you all going ooh and ah. So we've talked about the carbon cycle, we've talked about the hydrologic cycle, the nitrogen cycle. Remember, you've got to have nitrogen because you have nitrogen in both your DNA bases and in every amino acid. So you could not make DNA or proteins if you didn't have nitrogen. There's lots of nitrogen in the atmosphere. The air you breathe is about 78% nitrogen. The problem is that nitrogen gas is not a form that most organisms can use. You don't have any good way of extracting nitrogen directly from the air you breathe. The nitrogen has to be in a form that organisms can absorb. And the things that get nitrogen available for use are two. One is lightning. Every time a lightning bolt hits the earth, it passes through the atmosphere and converts nitrogen gas into nitrates, which fall to the earth and can be soaked up by plants. So lightning really does make the land fertile. Although I guess that's not much comfort if you've just gotten, struck while playing golf or something. But it does make the land fertile. And there are certain bacteria that can fix nitrogen. They can take nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere, convert it into ammonia or into nitrates, and those then become available to plants. So those nitrogen compounds made by lightning or by bacteria get taken up by plants, and then consumers get them by eating the plants. And then higher level consumers get them by eating the primary consumers, and so on and so on. So those nitrogen compounds might cycle through a food web for a long time. Ultimately, there are certain bacteria called denitrifying bacteria that, as part of their metabolism, they break down nitrogen compounds and put nitrogen gas back into the atmosphere. So with help from lightning, it is bacteria that are running the nitrogen cycle for us. This is another great example of symbiosis. Plants that include beans and peas and clover and alfalfa are in a family called the legumes. And they have lumps on their roots, these nodules, these round things that you're seeing. And they're packed full of symbiotic bacteria that fix nitrogen. So they provide nitrogen to the host plant, and ultimately they make that nitrogen available to other plants. If you don't have a lot of fertility in your soil, one remedy for it would be to grow beans or clover or something like that. Just the fact that those are growing there will improve soil fertility. And then some farmers will just till the clover under and let it decompose, and that makes even more nitrogen available. Most of the nitrogen fertilizer that you could buy that's used in agriculture is actually made by an artificial process called the Haber-Bosch process. And this is a factory that does it. Of course, nitrogen fertilizer is used in agriculture very extensively. Farmers will spread lots of it on their fields. You can buy bags of this at a garden center for your houseplants, but large-scale farmers will buy this stuff by the ton. And most of that fertilizer is made from atmospheric nitrogen by an artificial process that was discovered a little more than 100 years ago. It's made from atmospheric nitrogen, plus they need a source of hydrogen, which is usually natural gas. That's one reason you have to, one more thing to be concerned about is that when natural gas prices go up because of supply distortions or boycotting a country's natural gas supplies or something like that, that not only drives up the price of heating your home if you're using gas, it drives up the price of fertilizer as well. A lot of our natural gas is not used to run anybody's stove. It's used to react with nitrogen and make artificial fertilizer. I'll come back to that point, But the last cycle I want to talk about is the phosphorus cycle. Now, phosphorus is a major component of your teeth and bones, and we also encountered it in DNA. You might remember that every DNA nucleotide consists of a base, a sugar, and a phosphate group. Well, a phosphate is just a group of one phosphorus atom stuck to 4 oxygens. So without phosphorus in your diet, you couldn't make DNA. The major driving force here is rocks eroding. Certain rocks contain a fair amount of phosphorus, and rocks at the surface of the earth slowly erode. They're worn down by freezing and thawing, by chemical reactions with rain, sometimes by the action of things like plant roots. All of these things slowly break down rocks and cause them to crumble. When rocks are eroding, some of the phosphorus inside them is released, and that ultimately gets taken up by producers, and then consumers get it by eating the producers, and so on. So that phosphorus will go round and round between producers, consumers, and decomposers for a long time. Ultimately, phosphorus moves to the oceans. Ultimately, dead critters or their decay products ultimately end up in the water supply. Phosphorus moves to the oceans, and it might stay there for millions of years in the layers of mud and sand on the bottom of the ocean, the marine sediments. And then very slow processes of geological uplift, the forces in the Earth's crust that build mountains, may, given millions of years, turn those marine sediments into rock, lift them into the air, creating new mountain ranges, forming new exposures of rock, and then that rock will erode again, and the cycle goes on and on and on. So the main driving force here is rock erosion and geological uplift. And this is by far the longest, slowest cycle. It takes many millions of years to build a mountain range and then erode it away. I mean, we built the Ouachita Mountains about 250 million years ago, and we haven't gotten rid of them yet. It takes a long time. Okay, so there's phosphorus everywhere. You get rocks eroding, but on a global scale, farmers add phosphorus to their fields, and the phosphorus that you need for agriculture is mostly mined from areas that are rich in phosphate rock that has lots of phosphorus in it. You grind up that rock and you can add it to soils. You can buy this stuff in garden stores or from a fertilizer dealer by the truckload. One probably about thing number 14,397 for you to worry about is the fact that in the next 30 years, we may start running short of phosphate. We may start running short of these phosphate deposits. And here's what happens to phosphorus and nitrogen in modern industrial agriculture. Nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer gets spread on fields every year, and the plants growing in the field will take up what they can, but whatever the plants don't take on ultimately washes out of the soil whenever it rains, and it runs from the fields into drainage ditches, as you can see it doing here. Those ditches will ultimately feed into maybe a small river or a lake. The lake or the small river will drain into a larger river and ultimately out into the ocean. Now, something else is going on. When you have a lake, let's say, that has lots of nitrogen and phosphorus washing in, lots of nutrients, lots of fertilizer, well, the organisms that can use that stuff the most quickly are bacteria and algae and you get what we call an algal bloom, a huge population explosion of photosynthetic bacteria and or photosynthetic protists. Basically, the water turns slimy and green. You might have seen this in, if you've ever seen a farm pond in the summer, especially one that's just downstream from the cattle pasture, there may be an awful lot of nutrients in there, and that water might start getting really green and slimy. The problem with this is that these algae and bacteria, they live, ultimately they die. When they die, they rot, they're decomposed, and decomposers use up oxygen. So you end up with a lake or a pond that's got lots and lots of photosynthetic life up on the surface. Underneath the surface, the water is so depleted of oxygen that nothing can live in it. Any fish that were in there just die of suffocation. And you end up with a lake with huge amounts of green stuff on the surface. The lower levels of the lake are pretty much dead. The word for this, by the way, is eutrophication. EU, by the way, means good or real or true. Trophic has to do with feeding. So eutrophication is you're really and truly feeding this lake. And sometimes you can see it from space. That is Lake Ontario. Is that it? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's Lake Ontario. This peninsula of land coming down from here, that's actually Canada. That's Canadian territory up there. This thing right here is Detroit. Down here, you've got, I believe that is Toledo. I think that's Cleveland, the Mistake on the Lake, they call it. And in the center of everything is Lake Ontario, one of the 5 Great Lakes. And the problem in Lake Ontario is that fertilizer from all of the local agriculture, as well as runoff of sewage from cities and towns, causes periodic population explosions of photosynthetic bacteria, causes these blooms of them. And you have to be careful because some of those photosynthetic bacteria produce toxins. Now, all of this green swirly stuff right there in the lake, that's a giant algal bloom. All of that's algae, visible from space. And because they're toxic, in August 2014, Toledo temporarily had to shut down its water supply because the algae toxin levels were high enough to be dangerous. So eutrophication is sometimes something that affects very large numbers of people. 400,000 people temporarily had to go without tap water. Now, that's a pretty big disruption. It's going on as well in the Gulf of Mexico, right here, close to the mouth of the Mississippi and other rivers that are coming in. The Mississippi is dropping so much fertilizer and sewage into the Gulf of Mexico that the Gulf is becoming eutrophic, and the bottom water is so low in oxygen that most animals can't live there. Given that the Gulf produces, I think, about 1/3 of the US catch of seafood, this is something that potentially has pretty big economic effects. So what can we do about it? Well, I've done some gardening in my time, and I tried to do everything organically. And you've probably heard of organic farming and organic gardening methods. Maybe you try to do things like this yourself. And organic food, the jury may not be that much healthier for you than conventionally grown food. But the real point of organic farming and organic gardening is basically to take this one-way flow of nutrients and bend it around in a circle and use all these cycles that we've talked about as much as possible. Instead of buying nitrogen, dumping it on your fields, and letting it get washed downstream, you do things like composting, where you take your plant waste, and if you do it right, even your animal manure, you can even compost your own poop if you do it carefully so you don't spread disease, and keep it on your land, and you keep that nitrogen cycling on your land through your farm for as long as you can. Instead of having to buy fertilizer, you keep it going around and around and around through the food web on your farm. And that's probably the single most important reason to do it. This is the way that nature works. The reason why nobody ever has to spread fertilizer in a forest is that dead organisms in a forest end up on the forest floor. They decompose, they rot, they eventually break down. And as they do that, they're returning nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients back to the soil. And eventually that will be used by new generations of trees. So the point of organic farming is not so much that organic food is intrinsically better for you, although there's ways you can make it better. It depends on what varieties you grow. But it's that organic farming is basically an attempt to take what natural ecosystems already do, and instead of making nutrients flow through the ecosystem in one direction, is to put them in the middle of cycles and keep them in operation on the land where you grow your food. And it is 10:51, so that's a pretty good place to stop. So I will now stop the recording.